Vivian Youngblood signed her name on the last page of the document, capped her pen, and did not call her son. She was not the mother he still believed he had. Rewind. 9 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in her own kitchen, none of this had started yet. Vivian had trusted her only son with every account she owned for 7 years and 3 months. In a locked drawer inside his home office, the papers proving what he had done with that trust were still waiting to be found. She did not confront him that Tuesday. She did not call a lawyer. She did not tell her daughter-in-law what she suspected. She did one small thing, quiet enough that nobody noticed, and that thing would end with a folder of bank records, a revoked power of attorney, and a new name written into a trust before her son ever learned she had looked. Youngblood and Sons Furniture, built from one upholstery shop on Montgomery Street, was worth $14 million. Vivian owned 61% of it and drove a truck paid off the week her husband Theodore died. Every month, alone at her kitchen table, after the house went quiet, she opened a checkbook ledger bound in cracked brown leather, his wedding gift 44 years earlier, and added the numbers by hand, the way he taught her. A woman who could still do that kind of arithmetic was not a woman anyone could fool without leaving a mark somewhere in the columns. The kitchen radio was on low, tuned to the gospel station out of Yamacraw. Vivian's coffee sat cooling in its cup the way it did most mornings now that she drank it slower than she used to. Her granddaughter Selza's drawing was still taped to the refrigerator, a crayon house with too many windows and a sun that took up half the page. Vivian had buried a husband, rebuilt a company after a fire took the first workshop, and never once in 50 years let anyone watch her hands shake in front of a hard decision. Her son Elliot had held power of attorney over every account carrying her name for 7 years and 3 months since the purchase of the grocery store on Abercorn Street. The doctors called it a transient ischemic attack, gone within the hour. Frightening enough that she signed the paperwork herself, grateful, not knowing yet what that gratitude would cost her, one small withdrawal at a time, long before she opened the ledger and started counting backward instead of forward. What Vivian did next, she did alone, no lawyer yet, not even a phone call, just a woman standing at her own counter, looking at a coffee can she still kept on the shelf out of habit, deciding whether trust was a thing you measured by feeling, or whether at 71 she finally had to measure it the way Theodore always told her to, by the numbers and nothing else. Elliot Youngblood was 47 years old, chief financial officer of the company's parents built, and the only child Vivian left to call at 11 at night if the house made a sound she didn't recognize. He had asked for power of attorney the week after the grocery store collapse, sitting at her hospital bedside with a folder already printed, already tabbed. He had not asked twice. He had not needed to. Vivian signed because signing felt like the last things she could still control about a morning that had taken control away from her in the produce aisle, between the collard greens and the okra, in front of a stock boy who still sent her a birthday card every October. For most of 7 years, nothing about the arrangement had troubled her. Elliot paid her property taxes on time. He renewed her insurance without being asked. He called the plumber before she noticed the leak. She had told her pastor more than once that raising a careful son had turned out to be its own kind of retirement plan. What Vivian did not see, because she had no reason to look, was her son's own household 11 miles across town, where the careful CFO who managed $14 million of company assets in his sleep had also, somewhere along the way, stopped managing the truth. Renee Youngblood woke at 5:15 most mornings, before either of her children, and was usually the last ones asleep at night, after both of them. She worked days at Bethesda Memorial, wheeling patients between radiology and recovery for $14.10 an hour, a job she trained for and was good at, and had once believed would be enough. 3 evenings a week, and most Saturdays, she drove to Coastal Market on Victory Drive and stocked shelves until the overnight crew came in to take over. Between the two jobs most weeks, she worked 63 hours. Elliot had told her 2 years earlier, sitting at their own kitchen table with his tie already loosened, that the company was carrying more debt than people realized, that a downturn in commercial upholstery contracts had hit harder than the numbers let on, that they needed, as a family, to tighten things until it passed. Renee had not asked to see the numbers. She had never once been the kind of wife who asked. She had simply started saying no to things instead. No to the dance recital costume that cost more than 1 week of groceries. No to the orthodontist consult that could wait another year. No to her own lunch most days, which she skipped in favor of whatever Micah and Slella hadn't finished off their plates the night before. She had $211.40 in her checking account the Tuesday morning Vivian sat at her own kitchen table 9 weeks before signing anything. Payday was 4 days off. She did not tell Elliot the number. She did the same thing with money that she did with almost everything else in her life that hurt. She read it quietly alone and made sure her children never once saw her hands shake over it. What he found inside a locked drawer 9 weeks later would explain a debt that had never actually existed anywhere but in the story he told his wife. That part comes later. At the company, the woman who actually processed the transfers Elliot requested was Loretta Simmons, the bookkeeper who had kept the books at Youngblood and Sons for 22 years, 4 years short of a retirement she had already picked a date for. Elliot signed off on his own reimbursements the way he signed off on everything else, in language that matched every other invoice crossing her desk. Loretta had noticed, more than once, that the amounts under his name didn't always match a project she could point to. She had also noticed she was 58 years old, that her pension vested in exactly 4 more years, and that questioning the chief financial officer was not part of her job. Micah was 11, tall for his age, and had been pulled from the after-school robotics club the same season. Renee started the second job, a decision Elliot had described as temporary and Renee had never once heard revisited. Sella was 8, and the karate lessons she loved, $40 a week at a strip mall dojo off Waters Avenue, had ended in March with no real explanation beyond a sentence Renee had practiced saying without her voice catching. "We're tightening up for a little while, baby." Vivian adored both children with the specific undemonstrative devotion of a grandmother who believed love was mostly a matter of showing up. She kept peppermint candy in her purse for Sella, and a spare phone charger for Micah, who was always at 9% battery about something. She had no reason to connect her grandchildren's quietly canceled activities to her own son's finances, because in her mind Elliot managed 2 separate tech ledgers, the company's, which she still reviewed with her accountant twice a year, and his own households, which was his business, not hers, the same way her marriage to Theodore had been nobody's business but their own for 41 years. She trusted him the way a woman trusts a son she raised to be careful. She had raised him herself, mostly alone for the last 11 years of his childhood, after Theodore's first heart attack slowed him down before it eventually took him. She had taught Elliot to balance a checkbook before he could drive a car. She had never once imagined that the same carefulness she was so proud of could be turned, quietly, methodically, against the very hand that taught it to him. On the Tuesday morning the story begins, Vivian was not thinking about any of this. She was thinking about a bridal shower gift for a second cousin's daughter, and whether the gravy she'd made for Sunday dinner had needed more for its sage, and whether Renee had sounded tired on the phone the night before, or just quiet, which were 2 different things Vivian had learned to tell apart over 71 years of listening to women in her family. Try not to worry anyone. She called Renee that morning, the way she did most Tuesdays, mostly to hear Sella in the background arguing with Micah about whose turn it was to feed the fish. Renee answered from the break room at Bethesda Memorial, her voice pitched low and even, the voice of a woman who had gotten very good at sounding fine. "Everything all right over there?" Vivian asked. "We're managing," Renee said, 6 words. Not a lie, exactly, just smaller than the truth. Vivian did not press. Processing was not something she did to people who were managing. But she sat with the phone in her hand a moment longer than the call required, the way she sometimes did when a number in the ledger didn't sit right, and she couldn't yet say why. She would not learn Loretta Simmons's name for another 6 weeks. By then, it would matter more than either woman could have guessed on an ordinary Tuesday. Let me stop here for 1 second. Renee never once asked anybody for help that whole year. Has there been a season in your own life like that, where you did the arithmetic alone at night and decided the people around you didn't need to carry it too? Tell me about it below if you're willing. Vivian started keeping Micah and Sella on the nights Renee worked the coastal market shift. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she had shown up one Wednesday with a pound cake and found both children doing homework alone at the kitchen table while a neighbor's teenager checked on them through the wall. Renee had not wanted to accept the help at first. Vivian had simply started arriving at 5:30 with grocery bags and a deck of cards, and after the 3rd week, nobody discussed it as an arrangement anymore. It just was one. That Thursday, 9 weeks minus 2 days before the signing, Vivian let herself in with her own key and found Sella at the kitchen table finishing her worksheet, and Micah on the floor with his phone charger already borrowed from her glove box, the way he did every visit without asking, because he knew she kept a spare there for exactly this reason. A calendar hung on the side of the refrigerator. The free kind grocery stores handed out every December. And Vivian noticed, the way she noticed most things without meaning to, that nearly every square for the coming month had something written into it in Renee's small, tight handwriting. Bethesda 7 to 3, Coastal 4 to close. Bethesda 7 to 3, Coastal 4 to close. Saturday the same. Sunday 1 line free, and even that one had a grocery list squeezed into the margin. "Sella, baby, don't you have karate on Thursdays?" Vivian asked, setting the grocery bags on the counter. Sella did not look up from her worksheet. "We don't do that anymore." "Since when?" "Since a while." Sela shrugged the particular shrug of an 8-year-old repeating a sentence she had heard an adult say more than once. "Daddy said we're tightening up till the company gets better." Vivian set the milk in the refrigerator and did not say anything for a moment. She was the company in every way that mattered on paper. She sat in on the quarterly numbers herself twice a year at her own kitchen table with her accountant across from her and a cup of the same coffee she drank alone at night. Youngblood and Sons had signed the largest single order in company history. 4 months earlier, a hotel renovation contract out of Charleston, worth more than the company had billed in the previous 2 years combined. She had celebrated that contract with Elliot, had watched him order the good wine, and thought, watching him laugh with the waiter, that Theodore would have been proud of their son. "Tightening up," she repeated, mostly to herself. She did not ask Sella anything else. 8-year-olds were not where you went looking for the truth of a grown Van Zeft sciences, and pressing a child for information her parents hadn't given her felt, to Vivian, like a door she had no right to open. But she carried the sentence with her the rest of the evening, the way she carried a wrong total in a ledger before she found the line that caused it, not panicked, just unable to fully set it down. Micah, older and sharper, offered more without being asked, the way children sometimes do when the adult in the room isn't performing concern, just listening. "Mom took the closing shift again," he said, not looking up from the television. "She thinks we don't notice when she skips dinner, so there's more for us." "She thinks that. Does she skip dinner?" "Sometimes." He said it the way you'd report the weather. "She says she ate at work." Vivian dealt out a hand of cards and let the conversation move to easier things. A science project on the water cycle, a friend of Sella's who had gotten a new puppy, whether 2 peppermints counted as dessert. She was good at this, at letting a room breathe normally around her. 50 years of business taught her that the moment your face showed what you were thinking, you lost the advantage of being the only one who had noticed something. Renee came home at 11 that night, still in her coastal market vest, moving with the careful quiet of someone trained not to wake sleeping children even while running on fumes. She towed off her sneakers by the door, soles worn through on the left side, same as they had been for 3 months, because a new pair was $41 she kept deciding, week after week, not to spend on herself. She found Vivian at the kitchen table, not the couch, a habit Renee had stopped questioning weeks ago. "You didn't have to wait up," Renee said. "I wasn't waiting. I was doing my numbers." Vivian tapped the leather ledger, already open in front of her, half a joke and half the truth. "Salah tells me she quit karate." Something moved across Renee's face, there and gone, the flinch of a woman who had rehearsed this explanation and still hated saying it out loud. "We're just being careful for a season. Elliot's been under a lot of pressure at the company. You know how it is right now." Vivian said, and did not correct her. She did not correct her because she did not yet know what there was to correct. She only knew, driving home that night down Victory Drive, that a woman who reviewed the company's numbers twice a year did not recognize the company Renee had just described. Somewhere between the boardroom and this kitchen, the story had changed shape, and Vivian had spent 50 years in business learning one hard lesson that changed shape depending on who was listening. Somebody was usually managing what got said. She did not call Elliot that night. She did not call anyone. She went home, let herself into her own kitchen, and sat for a long while with the ledger open in front of her, not adding anything, just looking at the neat column of her own handwriting, the same handwriting Theodore had taught her 44 years earlier, and thinking about how a person could know every number in a company and still not know the one number that actually mattered inside their own family. Nobody had raised a voice that evening. Nobody had accused anybody of anything. A grandmother had simply sat at a second kitchen table with a second set of numbers that didn't match what she already knew to be true, and had not yet let herself say, even privately, what that kind of mismatch usually meant. She put the ledger away under a stack of church bulletins and turned off the kitchen light. Whatever came next, she was not going to find it by asking her son a question he could answer smoothly. She was going to find it the way she found everything that mattered, by reading what was there. 2 weeks passed before Vivian saw anything that would quiet watchfulness inside her into something closer to a decision. It was a Sunday night, late past 10, and Vivian had stayed after dinner to help Renee get the children to bed while Elliot was still out. A work dinner with a supplier he said was running long. Micah's school uniform, the collared shirt required for the private academy his grandmother had insisted on paying tuition for herself, had torn along the shoulder seams sometime that week, and Renee had not mentioned it to anyone. She simply sat at the kitchen table after both children were finally asleep, a needle and a spool of navy thread pulled from a sewing kit that had seen better years, working the seam closed by hand under the one light left on in the house. Renee's shoulders were rounded forward, the way a body gets after enough months of carrying something without setting it down, and her hand kept pausing between stitches. Not from any difficulty with the sewing, but because she was catching herself before her head dropped forward into sleep at the table. She had worked a full shift at Bethesda that morning and a Sunday half shift at Coastal Market in the afternoon, and she had not once, in the 6 weeks Vivian had been coming around on Thursday nights, complained about any of it out loud. Vivian stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing herself. She knew this posture. She had held it herself 40 years earlier in a rented house on Habram Street. The winter after Theodore's first heart attack slowed the business down to almost nothing. Sewing curtains and mending choir robes for extra money after Elliot was asleep, telling no one, because telling people felt like asking, and asking was not a thing Vivian Youngblood did. She remembered the exact angle of her own wrist under a single lamp. She remembered deciding more than once that her son would never know how close they had come to losing the house on Habersham Street, because a child should get to keep at least one uncomplicated memory of being safe. She did not say anything now, standing in her daughter-in-law's kitchen doorway. She did not offer to pay for a new shirt. She did not ask why Renee hadn't simply bought one. She crossed the kitchen, pulled out the chair across from Renee, and held out her hand for the needle. Renee looked up, startled, and after a moment handed it over without a word. Vivian finished the last 4 inches of the seam herself, the stitches, small and even, the way her own mother-in-law had once finished a hem for her without either of them discussing it, decades before either a woman had a granddaughter of her own to teach. Neither of them spoke while she worked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, Wella turned over in her sleep, and the bed frame creaked once, and went still for a second, listening, before Vivian's needle started moving again. When she tied off the thread and bit it clean the old way, without scissors, she svart once, laid it over the back of the empty chair, and looked at Rente's table for the first time since she'd sat down. "You could have called me," Vivian said. 6 words, not a question. "I know," Renee said. Neither of them said anything else about it. Renee made a pot of decaf nobody really wanted, and they sat together another 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular, the water cycle project, a cousin's wedding date, whether Silas' teacher had ever emailed back about the field trip form. But Vivian drove home that night with both hands steady on the wheel, and something settled inside her that it had not been settled before, the particular clarity of a woman who had just recognized her own younger self sitting across a kitchen table from her and had understood, finally, exactly what kind of silence she was looking at. She did not sleep well. Around 1 in the morning, she got up, made herself a cup of tea she did not finish, and sat at her own kitchen table with the ledger closed in front of her, not opening it, just resting her hand flat on the leather cover, the way she used to rest her hand on Theodore's arm when she wanted him to know she was thinking, without needing him to ask what about. By morning, she had made a decision that felt to her less like suspicion and more like ordinary due diligence, the kind any careful person practices periodically, and called nothing more than good sense. She would request a full year of statements directly from her personal bank, full heritage, on every account that carried her name, not the quarterly summary Elliott's office normally forwarded her, the complete detail, going back 12 months. She had every right to ask for her own records. It was not an accusation. It was, she told herself, driving to the Coastal Heritage branch on Bull Street that Monday morning, simply a woman being careful with what was hers, the same way she had always been careful. The young man at the branch, no older than Micah would be in 15 years, printed the request without asking why, and told her the full statement packet would take 3 to 5 business days to compile and mail. "Take your time," Vivian said, and meant it, because she had already decided she was in no hurry to be wrong. What she did not know, walking back out onto Bull Street with her handbag over one shoulder, and the late morning heat already pressing down off the sidewalk, was that Elliott's assistant received an automatic notification any time a large document request touched one of the accounts he managed, a security feature he had personally set up 2 years earlier, framed to Vivian at the time as protecting her from fraud. The notification would sit unread in an inbox for 6 more days, buried under invoices and vendor emails, because Elliott's assistant was out that week for a family's funeral in Macon. It was the only piece of luck Vivian would get in the entire 9 weeks, and she would never know she had gotten it. That same week, 3 floors up from the branch on Bull Street, in the Youngblood and Sons finance office off Drayton Street, Lockhart Simmons ran a routine reconciliation she had run every month for 22 years, matching invoices against disbursements 1 column at a time. She found not for the first time, a reimbursement coded to a vendor relationship she could not locate any paperwork for, $612, filed under office renovation expenses for a renovation she was fairly certain had never happened. She wrote the discrepancy down in a private notebook she kept in her own desk drawer, the way she had been doing quietly for 2 years now. Not because BCU what she would do with the notebook, but because a woman 4 years from her pension had learned that it never hurt to have written something down before you needed it. The Coastal Heritage Statement packet arrived on a Thursday, 5 business days after Vivian requested it, a manila envelope thick enough that the mail carrier had to fold it slightly to fit it in the box. Vivian did not open it at the kitchen table that night. She waited until Saturday morning alone, coffee made, radio off, the ledger open beside her for comparison, and read every page in order the way she had once read every page of a supplier contract before she'd sign it. The recurring line was not hidden or disguised as anything clever. It appeared once a month, sometimes twice, under a category labeled Property Management Disbursement, routed to an account she did not recognize in amounts that varied slightly but averaged just over $1,100. 12 months of statements, 13 disbursements in total, 1 January carrying 2. She added the column by hand, checked it twice against the printed subs total at the bottom of the packet, and got the same number both times, $14,261 for the year she had requested. $14,261 was not a number. Vivian needed a calculator to place against another number she already carried in her head without trying. It was close to what Renee earned in a full year at Coastal Market, working 3 evenings a week, and most Saturdays if taken because the family could not, apparently, afford for her not to. Vivian sat with that arithmetic a long moment, the coffee going cold beside her the way it always did now, and did not let herself finish the thought out loud, because she was still at that point only certain of 1 year. It was a start. It was not, she understood immediately, the whole picture. A woman who had run a business for 4 decades knew the difference between a suspicious pattern in 12 months of records and the true shape of something that might have been going on far longer than 12 months. She needed more than 1 year. She needed to know how far back it went. Her answer came 9 days later, not from a bank. Micah's birthday fell on a Saturday in early October, and Renee had asked, almost apologetically, whether Vivian still had the folding table and extra chairs from Elliot's christening party, stored in his home office closet, since the last time they'd been used. Vivian said she'd get them herself before the guests arrived, and let herself in with her own key. That morning, the house still quiet, everyone else at the grocery store finishing party supplies. The closet was deeper than she remembered, crowded with the table leaned against a stack of bankers' boxes, and when she pulled it free, one box tipped, spilling a slim accordion folder across the floor. The folder was labeled, in Elliot's own handwriting, HOA documents. Vivian bent to gather the papers back into it and stopped because the papers were not HOA documents. They were bank statements, her own accounts. Going back further than 1 year, she sat down on the closet floor in her good church shoes and read. Her hands did not shake. She noted that fact almost clinically, the way she noted most things about herself these days, and filed it next to the fact that her pulse had not changed either, steady under 2 fingers pressed to her own wrist without her quite meaning to, an old habit left over from the last years of checking Theodore's heartbeat several times a day, just to be sure. The first piece was a printout of a spreadsheet, Elliot's own formatting, the kind he used for company budgets, tracking a running total by month across 7 years, going back to the spring of her stroke. The second was a stack of canceled checks made out to a name she had never heard of, Coastal Property Solutions LLC, an entity she would later learn existed only on paper, registered to a post office box with no employees, no invoices for any actual work, and no explanation beyond the fact that Elliot controlled its single bank account. The third was a folded property tax notice for a rental property in Beaufort County that Vivian had never in 70 furfers purchased 4 years earlier. The down payment traced on the street from the notes column to funds transferred from her account. The fourth, tucked at the very back where it did not belong, was a single yellowed page in Theodore's handwriting, a ledger sheet from 1983, mixed in years ago when Elliot borrowed a box of his father's old business papers for some long-forgotten school project and never returned it. Vivian held that page a long moment before she set it aside. The fifth piece was the spreadsheet's final line, a total printed in Elliot's own careful accounting hand at the bottom of the last page. $94,786.19. She did not cry, she did not drop the pages. She sat very still on the closet floor, listening to a car door, close somewhere outside, close enough that it might have been her own driveway, and understood, hands steady in her lap, the way they had been on the closet floor, after 9 weeks of not quite letting herself know, that she now had exactly one decision left to make, and almost no time left to make it in. If you've ever done the quiet math on a betrayal before anyone else in the family had added it up, just type Kamala's below. That's all I need to see. If she put the folder back exactly as she found it and said nothing, the party would go on downstairs in an hour with balloons and a sheet cake from Publix. And she would carry this alone the way she had carried everything alone for most of her adult life. If she took it with her, and Elliot noticed the box had been moved before she found a way to act on what she now knew, there was no telling what he might do first, to the accounts, to the trust, to a truth that had taken her 9 weeks to fully see. She photographed every page with her phone, her hands steadier than she expected them to be, and put the originals back into the folder exactly the way she'd found them, spilled corner and all. Because a woman who had balanced books for 50 years understood that evidence disturbed was evidence questioned, and she was not ready, not yet, for anyone to start questioning anything. She restacked the boxes, retrieved the folding table and chairs Renee had actually asked for, and carried them out to the car before anyone came home. By the time the first guests arrived for Micah's party at noon, Vivian Youngblood was standing in the backyard in her good church shoes, holding a plate of deviled eggs, telling her granddaughter's friend's mother that the weather had turned out lovely for October, and nobody in that yard had any idea that the woman handing out napkins now knew, to the exact penny, what trust had actually cost her. Desmond Barrow had been Vivian's personal attorney for 19 years, entirely separate from the firm handled Youngblood and Sons corporate matters, a distinction Vivian had insisted on decades earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with distrust of anyone specific and everything to do with a lesson her own mother had taught her. Never let the same hand hold both your business and your family's business, because eventually one of them will need protecting from the other. She called his office on a Monday and asked for the first available appointment that did not appear on any calendar Elliot could see, which meant, practically speaking, an evening slot after Desmond's regular staff had gone home. She arrived at his office on Whitaker Street at 6 that evening with a folder of her own, photographs printed at the pharmacy on Habersham Street rather than emailed, because she had decided, somewhere in the 2 weeks since Micah's birthday, that she trusted paper she could hold more than anything that lived only on a screen. Desmond read every page without speaking, the way he always had, a habit Vivian had come to respect. In the 19 years she'd known him, precisely because it meant he was actually reading, not performing concern for her benefit. When he finished, he set the folder down, squared its edges against the desk, and looked at her over his glasses. "You understand what this is," he said. "Not a question. I do, and you want to move forward." "I want to move forward correctly," Vivian said, quietly, "before he has any reason to suspect I've seen this." Desmond nodded slowly. The particular nod of a man already 3 steps into the legal architecture of a problem before the client had finished describing it. The power of attorney can be revoked immediately, in writing, effective the moment it's filed. That part is simple. The complication is that signing's authority isn't limited to your personal accounts. He carries delegated authority on 2 accounts tied to the company that also touch your name through the trust structure your husband set up before he passed. Revoking one without the other leaves a door open he could still walk through, even briefly, if he moved fast enough after he found out. Then close both doors the same day. That requires the corporate attorney's involvement, which means at least one more person will know before you're ready for anyone to know. Desmond took off his glasses, cleaning them on his shirt sleeve out of habit rather than necessity. The way he did when he was thinking through something he didn't love saying out loud. I can bring in Sherry Dunmore. I've used her for exactly this kind of coordination before, and she knows how to keep a file quiet until it needs to stop being quiet. But you should understand going in that the moment we touch the corporate side, the clock starts. These things get noticed within days, sometimes hours, once a second attorney's office is involved. We would need to move on everything, not just the revocation, inside a very tight window. Vivian sat with that a moment, her hands folded in her lap the way they had been folded through most of the conversation, still deliberate, a woman who had learned a long time ago that stillness in a negotiation was worth more than most words. Then let's build the whole window before we open it, she said. I don't want to revoke his authority and leave the rest for later. I want the trust redrawn the same week. Everything I have outside of what I need to live comfortably for the rest of my life moves directly to Renee and the children. Not to Elliot. Not through Elliot. A separate education trust in both grandchildren's names, funded now, administered by you and by nobody Elliot has any relationship with. That's a significant restructuring to execute inside one tight window. I've had 9 weeks to think about it, Vivian said. I'm not asking you to talk me into anything. I'm asking you to tell me how fast we can move. Desmond was quiet a moment, turning a pen over 1/8 in his fingers. There's one more piece you should consider adding if you're rebuilding the whole structure anyway. A provision requiring dual signature, 2 authorized parties, on any power of attorney arrangement involving family funds going forward, not just for you, for the trust itself, permanently, regardless of who administers it after you're gone. It wouldn't have caught this 7 years ago, not on its own, but it would have made it considerably harder for one person to do quietly for this long, without a second set of eyes eventually asking a question. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. It was the kind of suggestion that had nothing to do with Elliot specifically, and everything to do with the shape of trust itself. How easily a single unwitnessed signature could become 7 years of silence in her family or in anyone else's. Write it in, she said. Call it whatever you need to call it. I want it to outlast both of us. Desmond called Sherry Dunmore's cell phone from his own desks while Vivian waited, and the 2 attorneys spoke for 11 minutes in the clipped shorthand of professionals who had worked together before. Sherry could clear her calendar for the following Wednesday. That gave them 9 days to finish drafting, during which Vivian would need to keep showing up for Thursday night cards, Sunday dinner, the ordinary rhythm of a family that still believed nothing between them had changed. She thought, listening to Desmond confirm the date, about Sella's karate lessons, about the $40 a week that had felt impossible to a mother who had no idea where the money had actually gone, and understood that whatever this cost her, it was not going to be measured against that number. It was never really about the number. It had only ever been about who got to keep deciding what the number meant. They worked until nearly 9 that night, Desmond drafting language on his laptop while Vivian sat across from him with the ledger open on her knees out of old habit, cross-checking figures against her own handwriting, even though she trusted every number Desmond's office would eventually produce. When she finally stood to leave, her back stiff from the hours in the chair, Desmond walked her to the door himself. "I want to say something, and you can tell me it's not my business," he said. "You've never asked permission before. No reason to start now. He's still going to be your son on the other side of this. Whatever we build this week doesn't change that fact, even though it changes almost everything else." Vivian buttoned her coat against the evening air coming off the river 2 blocks away. "I know exactly who he'll still be," she said. "That's precisely why I'm not going to be the one to tell him what he did. The numbers already told him. He's known the whole time. I'm simply the first person in this family who finally caught up to what he already knew." Vivian Youngblood signed her name on the last page of the document, capped her pen, and did not call her son. The document was 11 pages. Most of it language Desmond had drafted, and Sherry Dunmore had reviewed twice, revoking Etite's power of attorney effective immediately, terminating his signing authority on the 2 company-linked accounts that touched Vivian's name, and establishing the Vivian Youngblood Grandchildren's Education Trust, funded that morning with a transfer neither of the attorneys said out loud, but both of them had initialed twice. Micah and Sancella were named as sole beneficiaries. Renee was signatories trust alongside Desmond. With the dual signature provision, Desmond had suggested written permanently into the trust's own founding language, outlasting all 3 of them if it needed to. Sherry Dunmore sat across the table for the signing, a woman in her 50s with a way of watching a room without seeming to watch it. And when Vivian set the pen down, she slid a second folder across the table, thinner than the first. "This one goes to the corporate registered agent, this Sharon," she said. "The termination of his signing authority becomes a matter of record the moment it's filed. He'll receive formal notice by mail within 3 to 5 business days, standard procedure, nothing that singles him out or explains why. And before then, nothing changes that he can see. No freeze, no lockout, nothing that would show up if he checked a balance out of habit. The accounts simply stop accepting his signature going forward. If he doesn't try to use it, he won't notice a thing until the letter arrives. And if he does try to use it before the letter arrives, then the bank declines the transaction and flags it as a routine authorization. The saying they'd use any account that changed hands for any reason at all. Nothing in that language points back to you. Nothing in it points to any of this." Sherry tapped the second folder once, closing the conversation the way she closed most conversations, without ceremony. "You built this correctly, Mrs. Youngblood. For what it's worth, most people per position want to explain themselves on the way out the door. You didn't ask me a single question about how he'd feel." "I already know how he'll feel," Vivian said. "He'll feel entitled to an explanation. He's not getting one from me. The numbers already gave him every explanation he's going to need." Vivian nodded once. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of quiet correction she would have wanted for anyone who had trusted the wrong person with something that mattered. Not a scene, not a public accounting, just a door that had been open for 7 years, closing on a Wednesday afternoon in a way that made no noise at all. Desmond walked her to the elevator afterward, the same ritual as their first meeting, though neither of them said much this time. When the doors opened, he held them a moment with his hand. "How do you?" he asked, which was not a question he usually asked. "I feel like a woman who finally finished her own arithmetic," Vivian said and stepped aside. She did not go home directly. She drove instead to Renee's house, arriving just after 4, before Elliot's usual hour and before the children's bus. Renee was on her lunch break from the hospital, home for the narrow window she had between shifts, eating a sandwich standing at the counter because sitting felt to her like giving up 20 minutes she could use for something else. "You're not usually here this time of day," Renee said, setting the sandwich down. "I wanted to tell you something before it arrives in the mail and confuses everybody." Vivian sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had finished a shirt hem 4 weeks earlier, and folded her hands the way she had folded them across from Desmond that morning. "I've set up an education trust for Mike and Sella. It's done as of this morning. You're named trustee alongside my attorney." Renee's expression did not move much, the particular stillness of a woman who had learned the hard way not to celebrate anything before she understood the fine print. Trustee meaning what, exactly? Meaning the money is theirs. Meaning you decides, alongside Dundbarrow, how it just gets used for their schooling, their activities, whatever they need, without asking anyone's permission first, including mine. Renee's eyes went for a half-second to the refrigerator where Sela's crayon house still hung crooked or a magnet shaped like a peach. Then back to Vivian. "Vivian." Renee set both hands flat on the counter. "This is a lot. It's not a gift," Vivian said. "I want to be clear about that. It's not charity, and it's not me feeling sorry for anybody. It's mine to give while I'm alive to decide how, and I've decided." Renee was quiet a moment, looking at her mother-in-law across the small kitchen, the light coming in low through the window over the sink. She did not cry. She did not ask why now or why this particular week, though the question was plainly somewhere behind her eyes. What she finally said was smaller than either of those questions, and more specific. "Micah's going to want to know if this means the robotics club is back." "Tell him it does," Vivian said. "Tell Sella the same about her dojo if she still wants it." Renee nodded. Once, the same efficient nod her son would give a nurse handing him discharge paperwork in another 11 years, and went back to her fryer sandwich, because her break was down to 12 minutes, and the bus would be at the corner soon. Neither of them said Elliot's name once the entire visit, though both of them, in their own separate and unequal ways, had spent the last several weeks thinking about very little else. Vivian drove home with the windows down, the October air finally cooling off after a long, wet September, and did not turn the radio on. She thought about her granddaughter's karate lessons resuming, about a robotics club Micah would rejoin without ever fully understanding why it had stopped in the first place, and about how rarely in 50 years of business a correction this significant had cost her nothing but silence, assist, and 9 weeks of careful watching. There is a particular kind of justice that never makes it into a headline, because nobody films it, nobody claps, and the person on the receiving end of it doesn't even know it happened until a letter shows up weeks later explaining nothing at all. I think that kind counts just as much as the loud kind. Maybe more if I'm honest, because it costs the person doing it something the loud kind doesn't. The discipline to let the silence do the work instead of your own anger. She was wrong about silence lasting, though she did not know that yet. Silence, she would learn before the season was out, was only ever borrowed. Somebody eventually opened the mail. 14 months later, on a Wednesday afternoon in December, Elliot Youngblood parked his car crooked across 2 spaces in his mother's driveway, and let himself in through the front door without knocking, a folded letter in his hand that had arrived, according to the postmark 6 days earlier. Vivian was in the kitchen, flour on her hands, halfway through a pound cake for Ebenezer Rest's Sunday bake sale, and did not stop working when he came in. The radio was on low, the same gospel station out of Yamacraw it had been playing 14 months earlier. The leather ledger sat closed on the far end of the counter where it lived now, out in the open, no longer something she felt any particular need to hide in a kitchen drawer. "You could have called first," she said. "I called you Monday. You didn't pick up. I was at choir practice." She kept folding the batter, slow, even strokes, the same motion she'd used for 40 years. "What's the letter, Elliot?" He set it on the counter, harder than the paper deserved. A formal notice from the corporate registered agent, 14 months old by then, that he had somehow only just seen, buried. It would turn out, in a stack of mail his own assistant had filed without flagging during a stretch when 3 other things had needed his attention more. "You had my authority pulled. Company accounts, My own mother's accounts. 14 months ago, and I'm only finding out now because Sherry Dunmore's office sent a follow-up on an unrelated filing, and somebody in my finance department mentioned it in passing like it was old news. It is old news, Vivian said. 14 months old, like you said. Why would you do that without talking to me first? Vivian set the mixing bowl down and looked at her son directly for the first time since he'd walked in, her hand still dusted white to the wrist. I did talk to you first, Elliot. I talked to you every single Thursday for nights at Ray's kitchen table, while you told your wife the company was struggling so badly that your daughter had to give up karate. I talked to you the whole time. You just weren't in the room to hear it. Something crossed his face then, quick, there and gone, the specific tightening around the jaw of a man recalculating in real time how much his mother actually knew. He did not ask what she meant. He did not need to. I was going to put it back, he said. Every dollar. I had a plan. The Beaufort property was going to appreciate. I was going to sell it in 3 years. Quietly cover the difference before anyone ever needed to know there was a difference to cover. You've been saying some version of that plan to yourself for 7 years, Elliot. I found the spreadsheet. You tracked it the whole time. A man keeping careful on money he intends to put back isn't planning restitution. He's planning to get away with it a little longer. I managed money exactly the way Ya taught me, carefully, methodically. You managed it the way a thief manages money, Vivian said without raising her voice, without setting down the spatula still in her hand. Careful is not the same thing as honest. I taught you both. Only one of them stuck. Elliot's jaw worked once, twice, and Vivian watched her son do the thing she had watched him do since he was 9 years old and caught taking quarters from Theodore's dresser for the ice cream truck. He did not apologize. He built a case instead, brick by brick, the way he built everything, citing the hotel renovation contract, the company's real numbers. The argument that the family had never actually been in danger of losing anything, that he'd managed risk the whole time, that a man was allowed to make decisions about his own inheritance a little early, if he intended to pay it back eventually. I raised your grandchildren, Mama. I built this company with you, side by side for 20 years. Doesn't any of that count for something? It already did, Vivian said. 4 words. She went back to the pound cake. He left 20 minutes later, without either of them raising their voice again, the front door closing behind him with more force than it needed. Though not quite a slam, a man leaving a room he still, on some level, believed he had a right to walk back into whenever he chose. Vivian finished the pound cake and put it in the oven at 350 degrees, set the timer for 55 minutes, and did not cry once, not that afternoon and not in the weeks that followed, because she had done her crying, if that was even the right word for it, alone at her kitchen table slaying 9 weeks before any of this became official. And she did not have any left over for the part where her son found out. Renee, by that December, had dropped the coastal market shift entirely, walking out on her last evening there with a small cake the overnight crew had shipped for. The education trust covering enough of the children's expense that the second job had finally stopped being arithmetic. She needed to run every single week just to keep the lights honest. She had picked up 2 additional shifts at Bethesda instead. Better pay, better hours, a schedule that let her be home for dinner 4 nights out of 7 instead of 2. Micah had rejoined Robotics Club in September and made the regional competition team by November. A small brass trophy now sitting on the bookshelf in his room next to a photograph of himself and Vivian at the birthday party 14 months earlier, neither of them knowing in the photograph what was already sitting folded in a closet 20 feet away. Sella, back at her dojo on Waters Avenue, had tested for her yellow belt the same week her father found out about the letter. Nobody in that dojo that evening had any idea how much quieter the year behind that small ceremony had actually been, or how many Thursday nights of card and cold coffee it had cost one grandmother to make it look, from the outside, like nothing unusual had happened at all. At Youngblood and Sons, Loretta Simmons filed the new dual signature policy into the employee handbook update that January 4 months before her retirement date, and told nobody at the office why the language felt, to her, like something she had been waiting 7 years for somebody else to write down. She kept her private notebook in the same desk drawer, unopened now because nobody had ever asked to see it, and she found she did not mind that at all. Some evidence only ever needed to exist in case it was needed. It had done its job simply by being ready, the same way a fire extinguisher does its job on the wall for years, unused, entirely necessary the one time somebody finally reaches for it. Spring came to Savannah the way it always did, all at once, azaleas breaking open along Bull Street before anyone had putting whippoorwills. And by the first week of May, Vivian Youngblood sat once more at her own kitchen table with the leather ledger open in front of her, the radio on low, a cup of coffee going cold the way it always did now that she no longer needed to finish it before anyone came home. She was not adding numbers that morning. She was closing a year. The final entry, written in the same careful hand Theodore had taught 44 years earlier, read simply, Education Trust, First Disbursement, Robotics Regional Entry and Equipment Fees paid in full. No signature required but Renee's and Desmond's. She underlined it once, the way she underlined every entry that mattered, and did not underline the 7 years of entries above it that no longer needed comment, because a wrong column, once corrected, did not need to be revisited every week for the rest of a person's life. It needed to be closed, dated, and left where it belonged in the past. Micah's team had placed fourth at the regional competition in April, a fact Vivian knew because she had been in the third row of folding chairs at the Savannah Civic Center, and because the program handed out at the door listed, in small print under sponsors, the Vivian Youngblood Grandchildren's Education Trust, right beneath the name of a hardware store that had donated raffle prizes. Micah had not made a speech about it. He had simply found her in the crowd afterward, stills in his team polo, and told her the judges liked the claw mechanism best, the one he'd redesigned twice after it kept dropping the ball on the first attempt. Selah, 3 weeks earlier, had tested for her yellow belt on a Saturday morning at the dojo on Waters Avenue, and had not once looked toward the door the way she used to on the Thursdays when a ride might or might not show up on time, because it always showed up now, and child stops watching a door once she trusts what's on the other side of it. Loretta Simmons retired from Youngblood and Sons the same week as Selah's belt test, a small cake in the break room, a card everyone signed, and a private notebook she finally left behind in the top drawer of a desk that would belong to somebody else by Monday. She had never once shown that notebook to Vivian, and Vivian had never once asked to see it. Some things did not need to be spoken to women who had understood each other perfectly without a single conversation about what either of them actually knew. On her last afternoon, Loretta walked the floor of the upholstery shop where the whole company had first started, ran a hand along workbench for himself, and told the new hire training under her that the dual signature line in the handbook was the one piece of her whole career she was proudest to have written, though she never explained why, and nobody thought to ask. Renee had not thanked Vivian for any of this, not directly, not in the language Vivian had half expected in the beginning, and had come slowly to be grateful she never had to hear. What Renee did instead, most Sunday mornings now, was call before church just to talk. About nothing in particular, the kind of call that is only between two people who no longer need a reason. I did not set out, 9 weeks before any of that spring, to become the kind of woman who investigates her own son. I set out to be a grandmother who noticed a canceled karate class and could not let the sentence behind it sit unexamined. Everything after that followed from one small refusal to accept an explanation that did not match the numbers I already carried in my own head. I think about that sometimes, how much of what people call courage is really just a refusal to stop counting. I was never trying to punish my son. I was trying to make sure two children I loved never had to learn what it costs to trust the wrong person with the truth. I still don't know if Elliot will ever call and ask to start over. Some evenings I wonder if I would even know what to say if he did. There is a version of this story where a mother confronts her son the moment she suspects him, where voices rise and doors slam, and the whole family knows everything by dinner. That is not the version I lived. Mine took 9 quiet weeks, 1 ledger, and a folder that was never supposed to be found, and I have come to believe the quiet version costs more, not less, because it asks you to carry the whole weight of what you know completely alone until the moment you are finally ready to set it down correctly. Nobody applauds a woman for waiting 9 weeks. Nobody writes a headline about the 2 months she spent watching a calendar for a canceled karate class instead of confronting the person who canceled it. But I have come to think that patience is its own form of strength, the kind that does not need anybody watching to know it happened. If you were Vivian, sitting on that closet floor in your good church shoes with 7 years of your own bank statements spread across your lap, what would you have done first? Would you have confronted him that same afternoon? Or would you have done exactly what she did and waited until the numbers could speak for themselves? Leave your answer below. If you know someone carrying something like this alone, something they haven't said out loud to anybody yet, pass this one on to them. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. See you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, names, and events are imagined, but the experiences they reflect, the quiet arithmetic of financial abuses, love each other, and the discipline it takes to protect someone without ever raising your voice, those are real. Elder financial exploitation by a family member is among the most underreported forms of abuse in the country, precisely because it hides inside trust instead of breaking it all at once. Thank you for watching.